kiss for you.
Alright, we're looking at Path of Exile 2 today, and the title of the video is that Path of Exile 2 still kind of sucks, so it is going to be on sort of more than one negative side. But I ultimately wanted to focus on the fact that Path of Exile 2, I don't believe, is designed in the way that the developers are actually intending for it to be designed, and how that is hurting both their vision for the game and players' enjoyment. And I guess I'll just start with the fact that in comparison to stuff like Diablo 4, or Last Epoch, or Diablo 3, or the various other ARPGs, Path of Exile 2 really doesn't feel designed for what it was trying to be, which was a more slow, methodical, focused gameplay experience. And I think the reason for that is because they're trying to combine that more Dark Souls or more focused combat style with a target to something like a wide expanding option variety of classes and of skills and all the customization you can do. And those two things have kind of always been at odds with the game, especially when it launched, but many people kind of overlook that because of the quality of the game and the visuals and the skills and the bosses and the good stuff about the game, right? But as it's been about 10 months now here and in the third season, there has really been a shift to kind of understanding that like there is something fundamentally not working about how this game is designed. And while I haven't cracked the case or anything, I think I can shine at least some light into why. Again, the first part is the fact that I don't feel like a lot of the systems in the game, whether it comes to its skills, its class design, as well as the options that you have for gear, really lend itself well to that more slow and focused gameplay on anything that isn't bosses. And the reason I say that is because I think the bosses in this game are fantastic for the most part and really highlight what the game does well. The problem is you're not fighting bosses most of the time, you're fighting the normal enemies. So I really think that focused and slow gameplay doesn't really apply well to the game and how the game is operating. And I'll give a good example for it. In the first couple zones here, and I think this is most prevalent because it is when you're learning the game, in the first couple zones, you'll very quickly encounter in a forest a lot of dogs or werewolves or whatever, right? And they're very quick. And for most classes in the game, in this case you're seeing mercenary gameplay, for most classes in the game, they don't have a good way to deal with that. For both targeting and for damage reasons. In my case, most of my abilities and skills early on are relegated to burst damage and shotgun damage, whether it be freeze or fire or poison or just general armor penetration. They're all shotgun style. I do have a couple of more directed fire options, but every time I switch to something, my mana goes down, right? So ultimately, I have one option to sort of do a little bit more damage, and that's a rapid fire one at an enemy that's rushing at me, and everything else is a burst fire. So in that case, my class there is designed for burst fire and doesn't really have many options to not do something like that, right? The problem is a lot of the enemies in that game and in that first opening zone are not in groups. You eventually do get some grouped enemies later on, but early on, they're individual enemies. They're enemies that are rushing at you and you have to defend yourself, right? And at least my class in the Mercenary here doesn't have a very good way to do that. It does have, again, as I mentioned, the rapid fire one, but the rapid fire one doesn't do a ton of damage at the start and takes a while to get going versus the burst ones, which tend to do more damage. So what you're effectively forced to do if you want the best damage is burst a bunch of single target enemies, which not only is not very effective utilizing your skills, but also doesn't feel that good, right? Because you're constantly having to switch between your try and get your combo, right? In my case, it's frost and then burst, and the burst, if it hits a freezing enemy, it shrapnels to the other enemies, right? It's very good for clearing the larger mobs, not very good for single targets. So that's just kind of an example where it doesn't feel like the idea of being slow and methodical really works with the fact that enemies are rushing at you as quick as they can, and you don't really have an option to deal with that, at least for a lot of classes, right? Another thing that it feels like it's at odds with that more slow and detailed gameplay is the fact that checkpoints, right? Every single time, I believe Last Epoch has something similar to this, but it's not as much of an issue. Every time you go into a new zone, if it's been like 15 minutes or whatever since you visited, everything resets, right? You have to go through your checkpoints again. You don't have to go through the waypoint, I don't believe, but you do have to go through checkpoints, and you have to rediscover where the zone stuff is, and all the enemies respawn, right? That doesn't happen in Diablo 4. I believe the enemies might respawn, and they'll scale up, right? But all your checkpoints and stuff are still there, and their map is still visible. That's not the case in Path of Exile 2. So, wanting a more slower-paced game, having to constantly redo a thing you've already done to get back to it to go to another section, because frequently there'll be branches, having to go back through a section you've already completed to reactivate the checkpoints in order to get to another branching path here is something you do frequently in the game, and that is something that's quite annoying and grating. Right? That is something that other games like Diablo 4 don't do, that I think Last Epoch does. The reason it's not as much of an issue there is because the zones are significantly smaller for the most part in Last Epoch, and you can run through them a little bit quicker. They also tend not to have a lot of branching paths. They do have some, but frequently the branching paths are a lot less in that game, so it's not as big of an issue. There's a lot of branching paths in Path of Exile 2, and they want you to redo effectively as the new instance turns over every single time, right? The checkpoints and everything like that. That's just really annoying and something that I don't think adds much to the experience, especially when they require you to go through it and you're quite slow, right? Not in terms of movement speed necessarily, they add a sprint, but just in terms of your abilities, your skills, switching stuff, right? Like this is supposed to be a more meticulous process, and doing things like this really grades on the experience. It's like I can't go through this game in a relaxed state, right? You're in this game and you're in it and you're in the zone, you're doing things right. It's a very intense experience when something like, generally speaking, this genre is not known for that. Even, looters in general, like Borderlands, right? I'm not up and intense and everything when I'm playing Borderlands. I'm relatively relaxed. And that's just something I feel like you can't really do as easily in Path of Exile 2. On the flip side, and this is where we get into the other aspect of it, because this is kind of where we get into the build issues. The issue arises when, and this has been a thing since the beginning, when it launched 10 months ago, and this is still an issue now. The other side of it is the scope, right? The idea that you have all these options and all these classes and all these passives, but as I mentioned before for the slow and methodical thing, the game also isn't designed to take advantage of all the options you have. It really isn't. Like, the options you have don't relate and don't kind of like add together to create an interesting build most of the time. Now that could be chalked up to the fact that a lot of the ones that you have, aren't complete yet, right? A lot of the skill trees and stuff you have aren't technically complete. But I think it also boils down to the fact that like there isn't really a design conceit for the game. Other than trying to be more slow and methodical, there's not really a overarching glue that holds a lot of these systems together. They're kind of just placed in it, and the kind of sandbox stuff hopes it works well. And for the most part, well, they do work, like they function. There's no issues with a lot of the ways that, skills combine and that kind of thing, and how gems and supporting the main ability and what you can do in augment, right? All that stuff works, but it's not tuned very well. And I think that's kind of where you become to the issue. It's like when you have this amount of scope, it's going to be pretty much impossible to tune it how you want to. The issue is, having this much scope requires you to do at least some tuning so the game can continue to be fun into the later points when all of a sudden your sandbox stuff that didn't really matter too much because the game was easy is now really important, especially in the end game when you don't have any of that, right? Like, the sandbox only works until you need to start redoing content, until you need to start redoing and grinding for things. Then your sandbox and your weapons and your class skills or what have you need to be on lock, because if they're not, it feels like a very disjointed mess. You can see where I'm going with this. In an effort to try and be different from something like Path of Exile 1, which had a lot of that spammy, one button clear a room kind of stuff, which is why they tried to focus on like slow and methodical gameplay, they also tried to focus on expanding the kits that you can do, right? And the issue with doing that in endgame with a system that's not designed for that is you get very haphazard, not very tested, not very, thoroughly designed experiences. Oftentimes what that leads to is a lot of things. It leads to you not really feeling the strength of your build. It leads to not having meaningful upgrades for what you're doing. It leads to builds not really having the synergy that they need to. And all that ultimately relays and kind of coalesces into the fact that the end game, no matter how good the actual activities are, aren't going to be good unless you have very specific build constraints in mind to make it work within the current system. This is ultimately a big issue, and it was sort of an issue in Path of Exile 1, but that kind of got over itself by the fact that the game had been out for a long time and a lot of that stuff had been ironed out. But I kind of want to showcase that this is Path of Exile 2. This is their second attempt at doing this with way more experience than they had from Path of Exile 1. And while there are different things, it feels crazy how there's still issues as it comes to the endgame build stuff. That is not endgame in general, which most games don't have a good starting point for. It's the builds. It's the fact that throughout most of your campaign and most of the time you're spending with the game, your build does not feel that good. Not in terms of the actual feeling of it, because that overall is very well tuned. Just in terms of how it feels to actually clear packs of mobs and how the interaction of the skills and stuff, right? They just feel extremely loose and extremely kind of put there in place and hope it works out in a sandbox kind of way. And I think they overall need to have a little bit more design and intention in order to actually have meaningful improvements in that regard. And this is both from like the developer vision of the game and how it has to kind of move forward, and for the enjoyment of the players. Like, I think there needs to be a clear understanding of where builds are going. There needs to be a clear goal of like, this is how it should feel at endgame, right, versus the starting point. And you can't really do that when your scope is so unbelievably massive and your pieces aren't there yet, right? I would have much preferred them to start off with significantly less classes and 4 or 5 classes, not 7 or 8, and actually have a good mix and a good intensity to how they're tuned and how they're balanced and kind of the things about that. I don't need this game to be balanced, but I do need it to be rewarding, and I don't think it's that currently in most aspects. In most classes, this game does not reward you well for building anything, pretty much. Even if you follow a build guide and a leveling guide, your reward is just someone else's build at the end of the day, right? A lot of the power and quality that these games have is either the loot and being able to improve your gear itself, or also being able to improve your build. And if it doesn't feel like your build and it doesn't feel like you actually accomplishing this thing and building out your character, these games live and die off that, right? It needs to feel like that, or else it's not going to succeed. And that's where I think Path of Exile 2 is currently, is because of its attempt and focus at slow, methodical gameplay and its scope. It's really suffering in those aspects of being able to be fun and designed well and work for a lot of people and work for the devs. You saw this, what happened with Season 2, is that the devs didn't really know where to go or where to move things, right? And there was a lot of backlash in Season 2 about how they were sort of destroying the game and how it wasn't good what they were doing, right? And I kind of want to get in here at Season 3 and say it needs to be a larger discussion on where the vision for the game is going. And that vision needs to include a lot of maybe it's slower, right? Maybe it's working well and it's slower pace, but you need to be refining. Like, I want to see a patch that focuses on one class and really getting that class where it needs to be, right? And maybe tweaking some other things. But I'm tired of seeing patch notes that touch on every goddamn class all the time and are just spot fixing things across the board, because this is a very large board. Right? This is a very large landscape that we have to cut, and they're just picking at it little by little. We need big sections in chunks, able to address small parts of it, and while it will still be an issue, it'll show improvement. Right now, I think the issue we're seeing is that because they're doing patchwork stuff constantly, you're not seeing enough improvement in season to season or in patch to patch to really say, oh, the game works now, right? They did some stuff in this most recent one, like adding waypoints, like getting rid of the cruel difficulties. That was good. Adding interludes was nice. Adding a sprint was good. Like, there's better options here, but they didn't fix the build stuff, right? So I need to see the trajectory of the game going in a place where they are actively improving chunks at a time and not just throwing a bunch of stuff in. And that maybe you need a way that, like, shorter cycles, maybe more hot fixes, maybe less focus on these big grand patches that you do for seasons, right? But you need something in a way that showcases, hey, we know that this is an issue, we're working on fixing it, here's a patch that showcases this, we're explaining it, right? Now, obviously, you're not going to have this be working all the time, but I think something like that is needed because I haven't seen that. The most recent Season 3 was the closest we got to showcasing how they were able to address a lot of different things in a patch. That's good, that's a good start, but I need to see that continue before we can really I can, and I think most people can really recommend Path of Exile 2 to anyone. So hopefully that was interesting. Hopefully you found that good. If you did, then you want to subscribe to the channel, like the video, comment, do all that stuff, and I'll see everyone in the next video.